No, I didn't at all, actually. My father was a sort of diplomat who then later went into oil. But I think what's difficult to know is what your forebears would have done if they'd been allowed to do the things they wanted to do.
So you weren't under any pressure from the family to follow in footsteps or anything like that?
No, I wasn't really. In fact, my mother, who was more of a sort of anarchist, I think quite enjoyed the idea. She'd been offered a screen test in the early 30s, and my grandmother wouldn't allow it. So in a way, she kind of saw the point. I mean, to be honest, our traditions in this family were really, farming, the army or the navy. And none of those three were terribly realistic for me. So in a way, I had a kind of open choice.
Well,
my father once did say to us all, he said, if you are so unfortunate as to have to earn your living, for Christ's sake, do something important, do something enjoyable.
Well, enjoyable is the thing, isn't it? Yeah, and you did have a long time playing all sorts of different parts, didn't you? A lot of people will remember you, I think, from Monarch of the Glen, was it?
Oh, Monarch was a wonderful time for me. I had quite an interesting career. I started in the West End, and I went to Hollywood for a couple of years, and then I came back and did sort of stuff on television mainly, and some I went to the National and that kind of thing. I wasn't recognizable in that sense. I was the person that you thought you must have met when you were staying in Norfolk, So people would always come up and say, haven't we met, and I never had. But it was quite enjoyable. And then Monarch of the Glen came along, and that was my first taste of being sort of a little bit well-known, so that the taxi drivers would lean out of the window and say, when you're going to marry Molly, and all this kind of thing. And I enjoyed it. It was a very nice cast. My mother was Scottish, so I loved spending time up in Venetia, which is incredibly beautiful. I don't know if you know that part.
No, I don't, but I've heard it's lovely.
So it was a very happy time. But what made it particularly sort of memorable in my own life was that just before the second series, I was asked to write the film that became Gosford Park. During the third started after I'd been on the set watching it being filmed, and in the middle I went to see a rough cut in New York, and then the fourth series I started 3 days after I'd won the Oscar. So the whole of the Monarch of the Glen experience was all interplatted with the Gosford Park Oscar experience.
Well, I think it's fascinating that you moved from sort of the acting side to the screenplay and the script writing, but you had also written a couple of novels, had you not? In the early, when was it, in the 70s, thereabouts?
Yes, I wrote a couple of sort of what used to be called bodice rippers because I wanted to be in print. I wanted to prove to myself that I could write something that actually got published, and they were published, but I was told that you couldn't sell a historical novel that was written by a man, so I had to rechristen myself Rebecca Greville, and under that pseudonym I launched myself on the market and sold about 10 copies of each. But actually, I got away with it until I was in the West End. I was in a play called A Touch of Spring, and someone rumbled it. And I remember the headline in the Standard. It said, Rebecca is really a bloke. And there was a long article about me writing these books. And Barbara Cartland was rung up for a quote, and she said, no man can understand the workings of a woman's heart. At the time, I was rather offended, but of course now I completely agree with her.
Well, now it's interesting you should say that, because if we come on to Downton Abbey, I think your wife helps you, does she, with the storylines and so on. So is that really a perfect combination to have the female input as well?
Well, I think she's been very, very helpful to me. She is the first person to read any script I write, and she first of all, she takes out all just the straight mistakes, the misspellings and punctuation and repeats and that kind of thing. But also she'll say, this doesn't feel right here, or this bit's very, very boring, or, whatever it is. And so I'm able to have a sort of another view on the whole thing before anyone, even my agent, gets to see it. And that has served me pretty well.
When you are writing, and I suppose it's this thing of developing characters over time, isn't it, that must be quite a challenge for you. The new series has caused a little bit of consternation in some circles, but how do you go about drawing those characters and, in a sense, getting them to grow?
Well, I mean, this is both the challenge and the luxury of writing for television, that you don't have to get it all into an hour and 40 minutes. And if you like a certain character or a certain conjunction of characters or whatever, then you've got the liberty to expand them and to go down the road with them and develop their story and so on, all of which I rather enjoy. I mean, you have to take them on a kind of, to use Mr. Blair's word, journey, because they've got to be going somewhere from wherever they started, but at the same time you have to be careful that that journey is compatible with the person they are. We all know that thing of when in a television series or something, a character will be given an action or a scene that's just completely out of character for them, and you just don't believe it. And you have to avoid that. So that is the discipline. You develop them, but you develop them in accordance to the truth of who they are. But I've enjoyed it. I mean, actually, there was a big fuss about, not last episode, but the one before, but I didn't really understand it, because we've had a lot of, things happen. We've had the Turk dead in Mary's bed, and we've had the war, and we've had Sybil dying in childbirth, and we've had lots of things, really. But our sort of style of the house, if you like, is that we don't linger on the actual event. We don't show them anything particularly offensive on screen, because what we're interested in is developing the emotional response, the emotional reaction to whatever has taken place, and then we develop its effect on the characters. So in a way, that's what we're doing, rather than attempting to shock anyone.
I think I've read somewhere that you said there isn't really a bad guy and a good guy in Downton, but there are a couple of, certainly, characters that nobody likes.
Yes, I mean, Thomas, I suppose, is the nearest to a bad guy, but I mean, even he, when he was being sort of not framed exactly, but when Jimmy was threatening to report him to the police and everything, I think we were all on Thomas's side over that story. Well, I hope we were, anyway.
All right. It's interesting, though, that you're trying to make sure that there are nuances in all the characters, which there are in real people, of course. And is that what you're trying to do, in a sense, to connect with people's emotions?
Yes. I mean, I don't think anyone is all bad. I mean, there are probably some people who are all bad, but most people in our lives are a mixture of good and bad, including ourselves. And, we all can remember incidents where we've behaved badly, or we've been, even if it's just being rude, and you look back on it and you think, why was I like that? Why did I do that? And you don't sometimes even know, really. But we all have these different elements. But I think most people, and this is where I sound like Pollyanna, I think most people are just trying to do their best, and whatever their circumstance, whatever their background, whatever their ambition, they're just trying to do their best. And I think that's true of most of the people in Downton. They're going through a period of tremendous social change, which, of course, those years immediately before and just after the First World War were a period of terrific change, and they have to deal with it. But, for the most part, I think they're, on balance, good.
You're obviously a great lover of history, because I'm looking at a lot of the other things that you're either doing, have just done, or have done in the past. Most of them seem to have this historical aspect to them.
Yes, I do love history. I mean, I find history tremendously interesting. I think that there is a sort of fallacy which can come from kids not being exposed to history, or at least not having the right teacher for it, where they think of history as being irrelevant to them, and the people in history as being somehow a different kind of breed, a different people from us. But of course they're not. They're just like us, and they're living in different circumstances, and if you go further back, without any of the conveniences we know, or the methods of travel or communication, But nevertheless, their actual emotional responses, the things they want, the things they're afraid of, they're terribly similar to us. And I think that brings history alive, at least it does for me. But actually, I'm not only interested in history. I mean, funnily enough, probably my favorite film that I've ever worked on was a film called Separate Lives, which I wrote and I directed. And that was contemporary. But it was about people who lacked self-knowledge, which I always think is one of the sort of key virtues, to know yourself. And Tom Wilkinson played a character absolutely brilliantly, a man who thought he had his life absolutely under his control and he had the world on a string, but in fact nothing could be less true, and gradually the whole thing dissolved around him, and I think that remains my favourite piece of work, really.
Now, of course, you directed that as well, didn't you? So, I mean, is there something that you maybe are thinking is more important now to be able, if you've written it, to be able to direct it? Because I often think that some writers may feel, however much they admire a director, that maybe he hasn't quite just found that little whatever it is that a writer intends.
Yes, I mean, I would love to direct again. I enjoyed directing both movies I did direct, and I'd love it. But at the moment, I can't, because, a film, to direct a film is really to give a year out of your life. I mean, with the pre-production and the actual shoot and then the post, all of which stages are extremely important to the end product. And I couldn't do that at the moment because of the demands of Downton and so on. But I'd like to think there comes a day. I mean, having said that, sometimes a director and actors take something you've written and they make more of it. They make it more moving or more, whatever, than you had imagined. So it does swing both ways. I mean, sometimes you think, as you say, they haven't quite got it. But other times you're amazed by how much better it is than it was when you wrote it. And so I think it's a question of swings and roundabouts. Which
brings us, if we may, to Romeo and Juliet. You've come in for quite a bit of criticism on that, but you obviously feel quite strongly that Shakespeare's work should be readily available to everybody, and that perhaps with the way things are taught these days, it's not.
Well, I mean, I don't want to be critical of people who are critical of me. I mean, I think their position is perfectly defensible. They feel you mustn't touch Shakespeare, and that's that. I don't feel that, and interestingly enough, nor has any previous generation since he died. I mean, there can't be a playwright who's been more rewritten than Shakespeare, more or less from the moment the breath left his body. I think each new generation wants to find a way to connect with it, and there is a sort of resistance to the notion that, every 15-year-old isn't snuggling up in bed with a full copy of the works of Shakespeare and reading it for pleasure. But I mean, the truth is they're not. And if you want them to discover Shakespeare, and if you want them to enjoy it, and if you want them to find what he has to offer, I think you have to help them. I mean, of course, there are some people who are receiving a fantastic education and they go straight into it, and they, like people who can read Latin and chat away in it. But there are a hell of a lot of people to whom that does not apply, and it doesn't mean they won't enjoy Shakespeare if they can just be given a little bit of a hand to get into it.
Well, that brings us back, in a sense, to
this
history idea, and the fact that by many of the works that you've done, and including Shakespeare in that, you're giving an insight, aren't you, to people in a very sort of consumable way. It's very easy for people to get into it, and maybe do you hope that will whet an appetite in young people for finding out more?
Well, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, if someone saw my Romeo or our Romeo and loved it, and then read the original play and loved that, and then went to see a production of it, as far as I'm concerned, then I would have been completely successful, since that is precisely what I would like to see happen. But, nevertheless, the fact remains that if we had simply filmed the 3.5-hour play and not taken out any of the bewildering language at all, I I don't think it would have done well. And there is a sort of, people come on the wireless and say, oh, I think that's very patronizing. I know lots of marvelous young people who can't love Shakespeare. But I think that's just being unrealistic. I mean, there is a lot in Shakespeare for people to enjoy, and I think if you can broaden the number of people who enjoy it and just reach a group who wouldn't naturally think of going to a Shakespeare play, then I think, hurrah.
Well, I just have to ask you before we go, Series 4 of Downton, can you give us any little hints, or do you keep everything very close to your chest?
Well, I mean, the only when does it come, in fact, there?
Well, I think that these days a lot of people watch things online. I'm sure everybody's Christmas stockings are going to have the box sets if it's out by then. I know a lot of people who just have it's funny, actually. It's probably not since the days of the Forsyte saga way back when that I've seen so many people waiting breathlessly for another episode.
Oh, it's so nice to hear that. Thank you. This series, I mean, because Dan Stevens, who played Matthew, made the decision to leave at the end of the Christmas special and not to come back and extend his departure. At the time, I was rather sorry and I wished he had, but in fact, the way things turned out, it meant we could have a 6-month gap. So we start the series when Mary has been widowed 6 months before, and so she's really just beginning the process of rebuilding and of coming back into her life. And that is really the kind of leitmotif of the series. It goes right through it. We have other plots, but that's the sort of style of the 4th series.
And how soon do you start work on the next one?
Already started.
Did I detect a sigh there? I mean, it really is something that how long can you go on with it for? Have you got an end in sight, or not yet?
Not definitely. But, I mean, it won't go on forever. It's not going to be one of those ones that goes on for 12 years, I can tell you.
I think a lot of people will be very sorry to hear that. Julian, I've taken up far too much of your time. It's been a great pleasure talking to you, and thank you very much indeed for joining us. And I know you're fans all over Cyprus, and I've got some people who are waiting for the interview to go up online because they're fans over in the US. So it's
thank you very much.
Very nice to talk to you, and have a great weekend. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Same to you.